Okay, so hopefully everyone's had a chance to respond to the poll everywhere question. Not yet. Are you close? Great. 1 second. So this is like if you can remember back as far as Wednesday, then we were talking about autism and how there's a suggestion that it's a defect in neuronal migration and possibly in neuronal proliferation. So and everyone got the correct answer for that, which is always encouraging. Today we'll be talking about schizophrenia. And so we have cat pictures. And the significance of the cat pictures is this you don't actually have in your slide set because I found it this morning actually. But so the pictures on the sort of title slide and this one are all drawn by this guy, Lewis Wayne, who was sort of, I can't remember when he was born, like 1860, 70, something like that. And so he started drawing cats to amuse his wife who was sick, and then they sort of became very popular. And so this is an example of his, like one of his popular cat pictures. So they, like cute cat pictures predate the internet. And this one is called A Cat's Nightmare. And the interesting thing about him is not because I'm obsessed by cats, but that over time he actually became increasingly difficult and eventually sort of ended his life in an institution. And although schizophrenia as a diagnosis did not exist at the time, it's widely regarded as that he did suffer from schizophrenia, which progressively got worse through his life. And he continued painting and drawing through his whole period. And there was a sort of gradual change in his approach to his sort of cat drawings. And so obviously I showed you the sort of cat nightmare one. This is another sort of detail from one of his early pictures that like were very successful. But over time although he continued to draw sort of regular cats, he also started to progressively draw more and more stylized cats that in some cases sort of just pretty much transformed into sort of fields full of flowers and things like that. They became essentially very psychedelic before psychedelia existed. And whether or not it's true, that is often sort of regarded as giving a kind of insight into sort of like kind of the world perspective from the point of view of someone who is suffering from schizophrenia. So schizophrenia is the term schizophrenia literally just means split mind, and it like you don't want to think of it in terms of like split personalities, which is dissociative identity disorder. Instead, it's more a kind of, in psychology, it's sort of like they sort of term it as a sort of split between the emotional and intellectual realms. And it's although it probably is a pool kind of term where there's sort of multiple, like really there's sort of multiple underlying disorders. Schizophrenia is generally regarded as having certain cardinal features. So it's a group of disorders characterized by problems with cognition, motor control, behavior, and emotions. And so if we're diagnosing it with, like you have to have a number of these cardinal features, such as, like some of these problems with delusions or hallucinations, disorganized speech, abnormal psychomotor behavior, and negative symptoms. But you don't necessarily have to have all of those features. So for the diagnosis, you'd have to have one of the first three of these, but you don't have to have all of them. And so that kind of goes along with this idea that like probably it is actually a family of disorders rather than sort of one like unified problem. So to kind of understand what we're talking about with these things, we have to sort of say, like, what do we mean by positive and negative features? So positive symptoms aren't things that sort of like mean that, everything's great. Positive symptoms are examples of things that are essentially added to someone's perception of the world that aren't actually there. So things like delusions and hallucinations are examples of positive symptoms. Because, like, if you had a camera, you would not see the hallucination, whereas, like, the person might see sort of like a, I know, little green man or a devil or anything like that that isn't actually there. And negative symptoms are something that is essentially subtracted from the normal personal experience. So, for example, a reduction in emotions, so flat affect, or an inability to feel pleasure, which is anhedonia. And the most extreme examples of this would be catatonia, which is a motor symptom, but it's also complete unresponsiveness to any external stimuli, even though the person is apparently awake. So the cognitive symptoms are often the most troubling for the patients, because they're, like, it's, if you sort of have, like, these pronounced delusions and so on, it's not going to be very easy to sort of fit in with society. And they also often present as a very disorganized thinking. And so that you can actually see in the speech of someone who is, like, suffering, because it's going to be very random and rambling. And it's also thought to be linked to the inability of patients to really understand that they actually have delusions. Because, like, if they're not capable of sort of very logical thought, then it's going to be really hard to argue to them that delusions that they hold aren't actually true. And so that brings us to this sort of discussion of what is a delusion versus a hallucination versus an illusion. So delusions are obviously going to be fixed false beliefs that can't be corrected by logic, probably because of the already clouded logical thinking, and those that are not consistent with the culture and education of the patient. So, for example, if you're, say, like brought up in one of the Native American faiths where you sort of believe in spirit animals and so on, that would not be a delusion, because that would be very consistent with your culture. Like, similarly, if you're sort of, medieval Christian, and you believe you see sort of angels and things like that, that is also not a delusion. That would be consistent with, like, the culture in which you were brought up. So the delusions would be, like, say, like, someone brought up in, modern society who believes that, like, they have, like, like a devil on their shoulder telling them to do things. That would be a delusion. Someone who's convinced that there's a race of aliens who are secretly controlling the government, that would be a delusion. So basically, if you go to any of those sort of extreme websites, you could probably find some great examples of this. Yes. Yes, if someone, like, continues to believe in the imaginary friend and cannot be shaken in the presence of that, then that would be an example of a delusion. If they see it, however, the imaginary friend, then it becomes a hallucination. So, because that's actually the difference with a hallucination is it's going to be a false sensory perception. So it's something that presents in the brain of the person as an actual sensory stimulus, even though obviously there's no, visual sort of person there. And so hallucinations, of course, don't necessarily have to be visual. You can have auditory hallucinations, for example. And then illusions are a misperception of actual genuine stimuli. And in some cases, they can more likely to occur if there's a reduced level of sort of consciousness. So, yes.
Sorry, I'm having trouble picturing, I guess it'd be misperception of external stimuli. Would that be like if you have someone who's suffering from the symptoms and you prick their arm, do they perceive it more extremely, less extremely? Do they perceive it as something else entirely?
So in general, illusions will be something that everyone perceives, but then sort of, and we have an example actually right up here. So how many people see this as sort of like slanted sort of sets of blocks? So in fact, it's all completely level. And so this is an example of an illusion. You're probably, I would assume you're all seeing the same thing. But, you know, like actually, you know, as I say, it's all perfectly level. And this is an example of an illusion. So it's a misperception of what's actually there. And it's sort of, you know, driven by the contrast detection and the way we process contrast. And hopefully I'm not giving anyone a headache. But but that's to illustrate this distinction between a hallucination where the sensory perception isn't actually there, and an illusion where you do actually, it's going to be conserved because it's triggered by the way in which we're processing information. There's sort of like cool ones where you can see sort of motion and things like that too. Yes. Yes, because it's important, especially if you're sort of, you know, like in quote unquote judging someone on the basis of it. It's sort of like if you're brought up to sort of believe something, then for one thing, you know, like you shouldn't necessarily be trying to challenge them on it. And something that you're brought up to believe, like for example, how about an example of like flat Earth around Earth, right? You know, like if you're just standing in a field, you can't necessarily tell, you know, like if the Earth is round or flat. And so you could have, if you're brought up to, I don't know if anyone's ever read Terry Pratchett, if you're brought up to believe that the Earth is flat and supported on these sort of giant turtle, the back of a giant turtle swimming through space, then you will believe that. That will be your, you know, fixed belief. If you come to that on your own, then it's going to be a delusion. You know, like we're all brought up to obviously believe that it's, you know, like a globe. However, very few of us have actually done anything to really validate that belief. We haven't, you know, like, you know, tried to sort of, you know, do any of those different experiments where you can actually measure the curvature of the Earth. So, you know, if we actually lived on the disk world where it is flat and on the back of a turtle and believed that it was a globe, then we would have the delusion. Because, you know, like, so it's that kind of thing. So those are obviously, you know, clearly in the realm of sort of like cognitive processing. But there are a number of other features that you see in schizophrenia that sort of are a little, are certainly rooted in the same place, but it's they're a little more different. And so this includes things like motor disturbances. And these are characteristically seen in individuals who have schizophrenia. And so we've already mentioned various types of catatonia. Typically, this is going to be the catatonic stupor, where it's basically immobility. But individuals can have catatonic excitement, where they are just continuously restless with no sort of purpose. Other common features are things like something called stereotypy, which is basically repeated non-goal-directed movements, like, you know, rocking back and forth, that kind of thing. And similarly, excessive use of mannerisms. So these might be sort of like normal type behaviors. Like, for example, if someone is, you know, like runs their hands through their hair obsessively, that becomes a mannerism, even though many of us will run our hands through our hair from time to time. And, you know, like some sort of excessive, you know, like repeated facial expressions even can be a thing. Then there's echopraxia is another common feature, which is imitation of someone else, sort of like essentially automatic imitation of someone else. So you know, not doing it to sort of try and be funny, but like they almost can't help themselves from echoing what someone else is doing. Yes, you had a question?
Yeah, so when you say exhibit of too little negative or too little positive movement?
Yes, so the movement can be sort of suppressed, or excessive, essentially. So if you're, for example, in catatonic stupor, like then they're immobile and unresponsive. Whereas if they're in catatonic excitement, they're sort of, like just all over the place. And automatic obedience is another feature where, like even if they're sort of told not to, if they could be instructed not to follow a command and then given the command and then they'll perform the command. Like it's sort of like a loss of the real conscious control of movement. So as you would imagine, there are also behavioral disturbances which you'd see. So as someone is suffering from schizophrenia, typically they'll start to exhibit problems with social functioning. So this can be sort of social withdrawal or self-neglect, or like neglect of like the environment, i.e. sort of letting your house fall apart, that kind of thing. And can also include like socially inappropriate behaviors, like talking to oneself obsessively, using sort of obscene language to people, or inappropriate exposure, that kind of thing. And substance abuse is another common trait in individuals with schizophrenia. And so this can include, obviously, cigarettes, alcohol, illicit substances, and so on. And in general, patients who are doing that tend to have poorer treatment compliance. And interestingly, there's a suggestion, at least with abuse of cigarettes, that it is actually a form of a sort of self-medication, because there's some evidence that nicotine actually may help with some of the cognitive features of schizophrenia. Then we have our mood disturbances. So these in general are going to be flattening. So, like obviously we normally have our sort of dynamic range, and we'll talk of emotions, and we'll talk again about this when we're talking about bipolar disorder. But in schizophrenia, typically that emotional range gets compressed, so that largely they're sort of indifferent and apathetic to what's going on around them. And so this will lead to unchanging facial expressions, decreased frequency of sort of spontaneous movements, and sort of poor eye contact, lack of like inflection in the voice, and then this is thought to be tied to anhedonia, like the fact that they can't feel any kind of pleasure, and so which would kind of be a bummer, and just generally a sensation of sort of emotional emptiness. But again, we were talking about the behaving inappropriately socially, and so that sometimes this will also lead to sort of like inappropriate behavioral responses, such as, for example, like laughing, like at a funeral, that kind of thing. As far as the onset of schizophrenia goes, typically it's pretty much where you guys are, or most of you. And so just to cheer you up, it's however, so it's broadly in the early 20s. It's not particularly common. But this is sort of like a time of first diagnosis. So individuals who are diagnosed as having schizophrenia are generally regarded as having it as a lifelong condition, which like there can be circumstances which precipitate the manifestation of it, but it's regarded as lifelong, and like in general will require sort of lifelong medication in order to sort of get good control. So now you get to talk about some of this, and we will use the box in a couple of minutes.
Either one to three plus another disorganized.
Okay, so I'm gonna. Okay.
So we learned about schizophrenia, and we learned that our age, my age, is difficult to get it as a male. It's more diagnosed then. That there's different types of things that they can experience from delusional association. Yeah, there's a whole bunch of symptoms. There's positive and negative ones. That's it. Okay, and with that time for local test? Or Jillian?
There's 6 different types of orders. There's one that is stereotypy, how you pronounce it?
Stereotypy, yeah.
And that's repeated like rocking. And there's also automatic repeating the stereo in while in fashion. Does that really mean while in fashion?
So it can be sort of as simple as sort of like like explaining to someone that you want them to sort of like essentially not obey your commands and then tell them to sort of sit down, and then they'll sit down, even if they're sort of say, okay, no, I will definitely not do what you tell me to do, and they'll still do it. So, yeah. Exactly. Yes, exactly. And there's a subset of that which is actually called Mitgen, which is where if you sort of like tell them to hold out a limb or like hold out their arm, say like this, and tell them to keep it steady, right? And then sort of the psychologist would sort of then be trying to bend their arm, and you tell them to sort of keep it straight, and they would just like do that every time. They wouldn't be able to sort of resist because that's a portion of that sort of motor disorder, that like their ability to essentially convert the plan to resist or to resist the command is like essentially not working properly. So this type of thing is typically going to be in like more severe sufferers. Like there's a kind of spectrum of severity of schizophrenia. It's not like everyone isn't like completely debilitated by it, even without medication. But yeah, in more serious cases, obviously, the more serious the case, the more urgent it is to get the sort of medications to control it. Yes, that maybe not, because that's a complex task. So this is more about sort of simple tasks where if they have to sort of go and plan and find a cup and things like that, then they sort of may have totally lost interest by the time they, like they may get the cup. Right, they sort of won't be able to resist sort of, just kind of, that kind of thing. Yes.
The last slide, any indication as to why
Yes. Yes, it's willpower. Because it's like a fairly minor difference. So I mean, like there is a sort of heightened frequency in men, but I mean, we're not, like it's a few percent. So it's not like dramatic. It's not like autism where it's like 5 to 1 or something like that. So. Oh, right, that's true. Yes. Yes. I don't believe it has, because there hasn't been significant changes in diagnosis of it. Whereas, for example, because of the increase, like in autism, it's changed. Rates of diagnosis obviously have gone up dramatically, and part of that is driven by increased public awareness. And so with schizophrenia, I think has been widespread. Well, it's not a subtle symptom, I suppose. It's like if you're seeing things that aren't there, then, like, and exhibit all of these other features, you wouldn't necessarily, a family member or a friend or whatever wouldn't necessarily say schizophrenia, but they would think something was wrong, and it would lead to, rapid contact with, like a mental health professional. At which point, then the breadth of diagnosis has not changed very dramatically over the last few, decades. But what's that? Sorry. Yes, it's definitely genetics. In fact, this page. So yes, there is a strong genetic component. For identical twins, if one of them has schizophrenia, there's a 50% chance that the other one will also. So it's and considering the overall incidence is actually pretty low, that's like a very strong genetic component. It's about 20% in fraternal twins. And so unfortunately, it's not like Huntington's disease where you can look at a single gene and do you have it or not? It's a bunch of different mutations, so polygenic trait, and there's a large number of different genes that are implicated in it. And we certainly don't have time to go through all of them. And the point of this is to illustrate that, yes, there's a lot of genes, and many, but not all of them, are associated in some fashion with synaptic transmission. And so that's, like led to this idea that, it's a synaptopathy, a disorder of synaptic transmission. And overall, the idea, as you see with these sort of identical twins, is the fact that, yes, there is a strong genetic component, but that strong genetic component really is a sort of a level of susceptibility. And so you still need some kind of environmental triggers in order to actually present with the disorder. And so by environmental triggers, I am including, like things like emotional stresses, for example. So, and that is the sort of fundamental model for sort of, what is thought to lead to the development of schizophrenia, that there is some kind of genetic predisposition that then then gets essentially acted upon in some fashion by, like the circumstances of the individual. And in terms of explaining the pathology, we're going to sort of look at a couple of there are many different theories, which some of which are subsets of these theories, but these are the sort of two kind of big ones. There's the classic dopamine theory, which is essentially often stated as sort of just too much dopamine. And then there's increasing evidence that really there are other pathways that are involved in the presentation as having too much dopamine. So just to provide a little bit to sort of step back and just give some more justification for this idea that we start seeing this neurodevelop, that something happens through genetics and development that provides susceptibility. There are a number of pieces of evidence for this. So, for example, being born during the sort of late winter, early spring leads to an increased risk of schizophrenia. Being born in an urban environment, it carries an increased risk of schizophrenia. I was born in London, so in the center. So I am definitely in there. November. So I'm doomed. Those who are sort of being in the womb during influenza epidemics are at a higher risk. And similarly, in cases of famine, if they're in utero during a period of famine, that also increases the risk. So clearly, there can be things that happen prior to birth that can increase the risk of developing schizophrenia. And the idea is that it's like some very subtle change that doesn't really present until obviously the sort of 20s-ish year-wise and age-wise. And so that suggests that sort of like, maybe there's a subtle change and then you don't really present with the symptoms until that portion of the brain comes online. And then that lines up nicely with the prefrontal cortex, which doesn't get fully myelinated until the age of about 20, something like that. There's a theory that that's why teenagers are so difficult, because it's like the portion of the brain involved in sort of like estimating consequences for actions is not fully engaged until they stop being teenagers. So, and my son is 16, so plenty to worry about. So, another interesting factor is that there are pre-symptomatic differences. So again, you can see these if you do these large cohort studies where you have, like huge population. Some of them will go on to develop schizophrenia, and then you can actually go back and look at the medical records from before. And for example, you can see that there's this sort of weak correlation with, like age that you sort of learn to stand, for example. So those who took more than 12 months to learn to stand have a sort of a 1.8% chance of developing schizophrenia, whereas those who learned to stand in about before 9 months had about a 0.5% chance. So the risk increases threefold. It still remains pretty small. And sort of walking isn't the only thing. There's sort of things like early language difficulties, sort of poorer motor skills, gradual changes in behavior through sort of the school, like one's school career, for example. So there do seem to be sort of like subtle clues that can be seen in retrospect, but nothing that you could sort of identify prospectively. If you look at using sort of brain imaging techniques, you can see changes in the brain, and certainly in the brain of those who are fully presenting with schizophrenic symptoms. And so these include things like ventriculomegaly, which we've previously talked about as being one of the markers of reduced neuronal mass. generally there is this gradual loss of gray matter seen in schizophrenic patients, which frequently does begin prior to the presentation of symptoms. And so there are these sort of subtle changes in sort of brain architecture that you see. But, like fundamentally, obviously we can't replace the brains of people who have any of these types of disorders. So, like we want to try and come up with some aspects of the pathophysiology that, like maybe we can intervene with. And so that's what sort of brings us to the sort of dopamine hypothesis and some of the related hypotheses. So the dopamine hypothesis is largely driven from the fact that the very first drug found to help schizophrenic patients was a drug called chlorpromazine. And subsequently, that was identified to be an inhibitor of one of the dopamine receptors. Similarly, drugs which increase dopamine in the brain, such as amphetamines, can actually induce sort of psychotic-like states in normal individuals and exacerbate the symptoms of schizophrenic individuals. So this is this sort of idea that essentially you have the individuals with schizophrenia have too much dopamine, and therefore, that's, like what's wrong. And this is still sort of one of the mainstays of pharmacotherapy for individuals with schizophrenia. So just to explain how they even got to this first anti-schizophrenic drug, it wasn't actually intended to sort of help with schizophrenia. It was actually developed by this guy, Henri Laborie, who was a surgeon in France. And he was concerned about poor post-operative outcomes for his patients. And he felt that this was largely down to the fact that they were very hard to sedate prior to surgery because they were obviously agitated. They, were scared of obviously going under full anesthesia, especially since it wasn't great back then. And so that agitation made them required higher and higher doses of anesthetic, which then, of course, led to more complications for the during the surgery and for the recovery from the surgery. So his idea was that he wanted to find something that could, well, his phrase was a Pavlovian deconditioner, something that sort of treated the fear in the patients. And so he tried a whole bunch of things because they didn't need IRB approval. And one of the things he experimented with was this newly synthesized antihistamine, chlorpromazine. And so he gave it to his patients, and before surgery, they started to be very calm. And this meant that they needed less anesthesia. And so the surgeries proceeded better, and they had better recovery. And because of this calming effect that chlorpromazine had, he went around giving talks. And so some people who were treating, like the, I can't remember what the term is, like the dangerously disturbed, however they put it back then. Some of those psychiatrists thought that, maybe they'd try this calming drug and see what it did to their patients. And it was found to have a dramatic effect on schizophrenic patients, so that it really did, dramatically calm them and ease their symptoms. So, and actually, I'm going to just skip to the back here. And so this is just to the sort of end of that story. So it was first trialed in the 1950s. And so this graph is showing the resident population within institutions for these, severely, mental institutions. So there was this, profound increase in the population in mental institutions throughout the 20th century until the discovery of chlorpromazine. And at that point, then once that sort of started to be used to help these patients, then the inpatient mental population dramatically dropped because they were able to take this drug, and then they would be able to sort of fully reintegrate with society. And so you didn't need to have these giant institutions. And so for those who have seen or read the book or seen the movie One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, sort of that's basically right in this sort of period here. And so the kind of abuses that you sort of portrayed in the book and the film were largely eliminated by this sort of effective pharmacotherapy for schizophrenia. So enough of the So there's good evidence that dopamine is involved in schizophrenia. But it clearly can't be the whole of the story. For one thing, it's like sounds too easy for anything that involves the brain, because as we know, there's so many different circuits and neurotransmitters and so on that the odds of just being able to hit one and solve everything is not going to be very good. So one of the issues with that theory is that dopamine receptors are blocked immediately when you give someone a dose of an antipsychotic, as you kind of would expect from any typical pharmacological interaction. Like the antagonist binds to the receptor and blocks it. However, if you're giving a psychiatric patient chlorpromazine or one of the more modern equivalents, it takes time for it to have an effect. So it can't be as simple as just blocking a receptor. In some cases, giving patients dopamine antagonists can actually induce or exacerbate their psychotic symptoms rather than suppress them. So it's better to think of schizophrenia as being associated with the dopamine system rather than purely being a disease of too much dopamine. And so one of the ways in which you can sort of think of that is its interaction with glutamatergic signaling. So there's, also good evidence that glutamate, which is, you will remember, is the primary excitatory neurotransmitter in the brain. There's good evidence that glutamate is involved also in schizophrenia and psychosis. So, for example, one of the best pieces of evidence for that is the effect of phencyclidine, PCP. So if you give a healthy, like sort of normal volunteer PCP, they will tend to develop many of the behavioral symptoms of schizophrenia. So they'll have hallucinations, they'll have negative cognitive changes where they sort of, will become emotionally flattened. They will have impaired cognition, they'll have delusions. So all of these are sort of like, we're not touching the dopamine system, we're touching the glutamatergic signaling, and specifically the blocking the NMDA receptor. So that's suggesting that there's, clearly other circuits involved in this type of symptomology. And so there's actually a kind of good model for the regulation of dopamine by glutamatergic signaling. And the way this works is that the dopaminergic pathways that are thought to be involved in schizophrenia, which is specifically the dopaminergic projections to the prefrontal cortex, appear to sort of, their normal firing pattern is bursts of activity which are well separated in time. So you have a little burst of activity, like by which I mean sort of multiple action potentials firing in very quick succession, followed by long periods of sort of quiescence. So when you have one of these bursts of action potentials, you obviously get a ton of dopamine coming out. And obviously that will then activate the postsynaptic receptors. But in the intervening time, the dopamine transporters on the nerve terminals will then suck all of that dopamine back up again. So you'll have big bursts of dopamine, and then it'll all get sucked away again. There is also a second mode of firing that you'll see in these dopaminergic projections, where it's sort of a slow, irregular, sort of kind of ticking firing. And although this is lower frequency, it happens much more continuously. So it's ticking away kind of all the time, compared to something that's just doing a burst really infrequently. And this low frequency firing is driven by a glutamatergic input from the cortex. And so if we have the more of this low frequency firing we have, the more the basal level of dopamine in the surrounding space gets higher and higher. So it's basically like if you imagine, I don't know if you've ever had, say, a tap dripping, and like say into a sink or whatever. If you sort of plug the sink and have the tap just dripping, like you think that there's not a lot of water coming out, but you'll find it fills up the sink really fast. Any kind of sort of water leak is sort of drip, drip, drip. Eventually, it gets to gallons remarkably quickly. The same thing happens here. So if you have this ticking over of dopamine release, because it's happening for sort of so steadily and continuously, it leads to, it has a big influence on the level of dopamine that is floating around in the extracellular space. So this irregular tonic dopamine neurotransmission is setting that overall basal level of dopamine that's sort of just sitting around soaking all of the neurons surrounding. Yes, you had a question?
Yeah, so it sounds like too much dopamine for this drug and too little is not good.
So too little actually has its own problems. Like, for example, we talked about in the Parkinson's lecture, where the neuroleptic drugs, which is things like chlorpromazine, actually induce Parkinsonian symptoms. And that is an issue actually for treatment of schizophrenic patients, because there's a very kind of a fine line you have to walk to try and help them with their symptoms, whilst also not, like it's no good saving them from being in a catatonic stupor if you're then putting them into a Parkinsonian stupor. So that there's a lot of difficulties there that will come up more in pharmacology and therapeutics. So we have this slow trickle of dopamine that comes out, but that basically is setting the overall level of extracellular dopamine. And because there are dopamine receptors on the nerve terminals that release dopamine, and those presynaptic dopamine receptors act to do feedback inhibition of dopamine release. If we have a high basal level of dopamine, we get less dopamine release. Does that make sense to everyone? So these are presynaptic inhibitory dopamine receptors. And so they're detecting this low-level basal dopamine that's floating around everywhere. And because they're, like detecting it, they're inhibiting the release of dopamine from those nerve terminals. It is a negative feedback. And because that basal level of dopamine is being triggered by glutamate, if you block that glutamatergic signaling, you get a lower basal level of dopamine. Does that make sense to everyone? So in that case, now we've taken away that tonic inhibition of dopamine release, which means that for the essentially the behaviorally relevant bursting type activity, we now get more dopamine out because we've removed that inhibition. Does that make sense to everyone? So it's an example of essentially dopamine spillover, this sort of basal activity, basal levels of dopamine is being modulated by this glutamatergic input. And so, but that's then shaping the responses to sort of the burst firing of these dopaminergic neurons. And it's that burst firing in the context of too little glutamatergic input that is thought to sort of be the sort of in quote unquote too much dopamine that gives rise to the symptoms of schizophrenia. So just to finish up, so because we have at least you know, like these sort of so-called typical antipsychotic drugs, which are, as I mentioned, work through the dopamine system. There are atypical antipsychotic drugs which do still have effects on the dopamine system, but also have effects on other neurotransmitter systems, including serotonin. But all of our antipsychotic drugs act through dopamine, amongst other things. And because we have them, that's led to this pronounced change in the treatment for psychiatric disorders, because in many cases, you know, like it used to be that sort of individuals who had these severe disorders were all, you know, just kind of grouped up and shoved into these mental institutions. Now, because they can easily be controlled, or they can easily control their own symptoms, essentially, by medication, you know, like being persistent with their medications, that led to the sort of like you know, like closure essentially of these large mental institutions, because people could, you know, function fully and normally in society. And so, you know, like there are brief hospitalizations in order to initiate therapy, which would then typically last for like, you know, like a couple of weeks, rather than, you know, like someone being essentially locked up for life. So initially there would be sort of the goals to sort of reduce the agitation and hostility of the patient, and sort of normalize sleep and eating patterns, and then basically adjust the dose to find something that did not give too many adverse effects, but did give good symptomatic control. An important factor, though, is that maintenance therapy really does seem to be pretty crucial. Not necessarily because they're sort of continuously exhibiting these symptoms, but if in sort of patients who are, you know, like maintained on a sort of maintenance therapy, the relapse rate is going to be you know, like roundabout sort of 1 in 5 if they're on maintenance therapy, versus pretty much guaranteed relapse if they are not on the maintenance therapy. That's the sort of crucial aspect of compliance with the sort of medications for this patient population. And of course, if patients have significant adverse effects, their compliance is obviously not necessarily guaranteed, because no one wants to take something that makes them feel bad. So we are pretty much out of time. So no one gets to be called upon. And on Monday, bright and early at 8 o'clock, we will be talking about sleep.
Oh, the irony.
Yeah, I know.